A presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialogue Assassination with research specialist Mae Brussell. For KLRB, I'm Gloria Barron. Well, to start things off, Mae, let's review what we are doing on the programs.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Gloria. We pick up new listeners, I hope, every week, and some want us to restate the purpose of this show. And I think a lot of my listeners wonder, as I throw out these facts, where I'm getting this information. I don't review each week where I get my information, so we'll go into that right now. The purpose of the show is to illustrate that there were political assassinations in the United States that I call under the category of conspiracy. That the chance that Lee Oswald walked in and killed John Kennedy was not the fact at all, like people would want to believe, or that Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy, or James Ray killed Martin Luther King. And I would like to show every week a little bit of evidence in the hour that we have that indicates through my 8 years research that these were conspiracies and that they were planned by the same people for the same purposes, and the conspiracies continue to exist. When these men were buried, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, their bodies were laid to rest. The persons who had part of murdering them live. They're free today. They walk the streets. They make our foreign policy. They decide your economy, your lives, who goes to war, what countries we're friendly with, who we'll recognize, who we'll turn our back on, who we will aid. They will make decisions right down to the local level and the state level, whether you're going to be able to have legal abortions. They'll decide on the death penalty. The persons who were involved in the political assassinations are not far-away creatures with no names. They have names, they have positions, they move up into place. And for those of you who listened before, we name names. I don't want to scare you like a scare show. These people have names and identities. And the only way you can solve a problem is to face it and not ignore it. It's like somebody working in a laboratory and looking through a microscope and recognizing a particular disease like mononucleosis and going back to the family and explaining that you have this particular disease, and they say, no, I have a head cold, I'll be better tomorrow. And you say, the microscope and the diagnosis, the evidence is in the blood cells that you have mononucleosis or hepatitis. And this particular person says, I don't know what that instrument is. I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? They just don't have the capacity to visualize what you see through the magnifying glass. And in the case of political assassinations, I've spent 8 years doing research trying to find the disease in our country and give it a name and then come up with a diagnosis. And the second part of my concern is not only to show that there were political assassinations that were conspiracies, but that these murders affect today's news. And this is why every week we talk about things that are in the current news and try to link them to the past assassinations.
Right.
And the bulk of my material is taken from the sworn testimony of the commission members, the material, the information on the assassinations that I did in detail were first, to start with the John Kennedy murder, the commission hearings that were published by the government printing office. Now, since the death of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, we don't have access to any of that information, which I'm going to go into in a few minutes. But by cross-filing the information on the John Kennedy assassination, you know how the information was gathered and how it was distorted. And then you know the clues to look for in the other murders. And even though we don't have access to the actual data, we have enough to know what happened, like the autopsy of Robert Kennedy was seen, and we know that the bullet was 1 inch from the back of the head, not in a position where Sirhan stood. So the material that's locked up, I will talk about in a few minutes. Now, when we talk about political assassinations, I didn't realize, Gloria, how many people still did not believe or do not believe that there was a conspiracy. And we went on the air in June, and I talk every week, and I bring up all these different subjects. And sometimes it's amazing for people to come and say, do you really think there was a conspiracy? Because I take it for granted from all my years of work, not just take it for granted, but I worked all these years. And I know there was because I have documents and evidence to point that out. So then I go on to share some of that, and you can't put it all together in 1 hour or 2 hours. So a lot of people get lost. And the problem of understanding these conspiracies is something which I call mind control. And the first book that I wanted to do on the political assassinations, to sit down to do, was to study the subject of how do you get an entire nation to accept the Warren Report or accept the story that Oswald killed John Kennedy. How do you affect thinking people to accept the fact that there was this conspiracy? And there were 4 ways that this was accomplished, and I'll go into those briefly. The first way was the news control within 24 hours after the assassination of John Kennedy. When District Attorney Henry Wade and Chief of Police, the captain of homicide, Mr. Will Fritz, in Dallas, had a news conference Friday night in front of Lee Harvey Oswald and told the news media 4 things. They said, number 1, they had the necessary evidence to convict Oswald. Number 2, the case was closed. Number 3, Oswald was a communist, a loner, a misfit. And number 4, he was the only suspect. There was no conspiracy. He did it alone. Now, this was the night of the assassination. The citizens listened to the news, and it went over and over again. And the evidence they cited was that there were fingerprints on the rifle, that the rifle ownership was verified, the paraffin tests were positive. They had pictures of the suspect holding a rifle and a pistol, and that he had been to Russia and had a Russian wife. Now, I brought in the studio documents from the commission members, which we may read some of them next week. We may have time to go into later. There were no fingerprints on Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. The ownership has never been properly verified. The paraffin tests were negative on his cheek that he could have shot a rifle. The picture of him holding a rifle is highly suspect to every kind of a test. He said his head was superimposed on that body, and I have the name of the person whose body it was on. This was done from years of research. But when the evidence came in of the errors in the first news media coverage, it never made the headlines again.
They're all just exactly opposite
of what
they had been told.
But when, after 8 years' research, or after 1 year's work, when the commission was finished, nobody made headlines by saying that Mr. Latona of the FBI went over that rifle. He received it within 24 hours in Washington, and he gave it every possible test, and he powdered it and photographed it, filmed it, and did everything that 35 years that the FBI had trained him to do, and found no fingerprints at all. And about a week after he had the rifle, a Lieutenant Day from the Dallas Police Force sent a letter to Mr. Latona with what he said was the palm print of Lee Oswald that was lifted off the rifle. It arrived 7 days later. Well, among my documents from the National Archives now is a letter as late as August of 1964, the commission asking J. Edgar Hoover, please get information on Lieutenant Day. How did he take that lift? Where did he get it? Who gave him the orders? Was this his usual duty? Who saw him do it? Why didn't he protect it with something when he sent it to Washington? Why didn't it show up? If Mr. Latona said the rifle had wood on it that wouldn't hold a print very well, it was hard to get fingerprints, how could Lieutenant Day get the palm print to stick? Well, the commission had a lot of questions that they asked as late as August, and the Warren Report was published in September, and not one of those questions was answered satisfactorily. But that didn't make the headlines. Now, the news control for the first 24 hours sets in your mind the image of what happened. Then, to carry that further, Lyndon Johnson appointed what he called a prestigious commission. And for all practical purposes, it would look like it was a prestigious commission. There was Allen Dulles, John J. McCloy, Gerald Ford, Richard Russell, Hale Boggs, and John Cooper. But when you analyze those people, Allen Dulles used to be chief of the CIA, and he's the man that John Kennedy removed from the CIA when he said there was a hidden government behind his back. Richard Russell is from the South. He is not very favorable to the civil rights positions. He's the gentleman who said, I don't ask what Georgia can do for my country. I want to know what my country can do for Georgia. And in Reader's Digest, he had a long article that Georgia supported entirely on warfare bases and ammunition factories and building warfare machinery. That he's proud that Georgia is able to serve its country by doing this kind of thing. Now, he's the lone watchdog, or one of the two or three that watches the CIA for the Senate. Hale Boggs and John Cooper were close friends of Lyndon Johnson. They read part of the wedding ceremony at their daughter's weddings. They've been lifelong friends. Gerald Ford is a member of the Congress who is sympathetic with escalating the war, making a parking lot out of Vietnam, and such ideas. He was not in accord with pulling out of Vietnam at any time. John J. McCloy, head of the World Bank, and his law office was the conduit for Hans Tuft and CIA agents. He's worked with the largest economy blocks of the Eastern Seaboard. It was not a homogeneous group. There was not a pro-Kennedy person on the commission. They were similar in their opinions on civil rights, where Mr. Kennedy and his brother, President Kennedy, were not very popular, and they were not against the escalation of the war in any way. And therefore, I cannot say that this commission was pro-Kennedy or sympathetic to John Kennedy in any particular way. So to control your heads when the assassination took place, you had the news control for the first 48 hours, and within a week you had a prestigious commission. Now, the third motive to control your mind was to discredit any person who criticized the commission when it was to come out. Your sanity was challenged, and I'll give you just three quick examples of that. One of them was Louis Nizer in his introduction to the hardbound copy of the Warren Report, said critics are like scavengers who swoop down on tragedy and they feed until their stomachs burst with publicity. They create a brew of mystery and inflammatory conjecture as fantastic as the crime itself. Harrison Salisbury of the New York Times, Salisbury wrote an introduction to the paperback edition of the Warren Report. He said the critics of the Warren Report are self-serving. Their objective is to undermine the standing of the United States and its governmental structure. They aim at sowing mistrust and confusion at home. They are men skilled, able, hampered neither by scruple nor principle, ready to convert the national mood to selfish and particular ends, end quote. Now, remember, this was before anybody had read the Warren Report, Gloria. This was when the Warren Report was coming out. That this was the introduction to the book, that anyone who questioned it would be undermining the United States.
Sort of sets the tone, doesn't it?
It sets the tone. Yeah, I could read about 40 examples of people being really sick or misfits. Now, if you want a local version of the truth about the assassination, there's a book called The Truth About the Assassination by Charles Roberts. It's an answer to the Warren Report critics, and we could do 20 continuous weeks on taking his arguments and showing where they're false. But Thrifty Drugstore on the peninsula here has a table where you can buy for 20 cents this book now. It's flooded. Everybody tells me Thrifty has the book on the answer to the critics. And in there, Charles Roberts begins by saying there's three kinds of people who would attack the Warren Report. Number one, the scholarly people who had good intentions but ignored the testimony. Two, the desire for notoriety and money. And three, clearly psychotic. Okay. Now, the Warren Report came out, and they had a big problem. This is to convince everybody that there was a no conspiracy. Even in their own minds, the commissions were sending memos back and forth, May, June, July, on this particular thing. But it was to be published in September, and a letter went out from the commission from Mr. Goldberg, the historian, to Lee Rankin, dated, this is May the 4th. And it said, events subsequent to the assassination are concerned chiefly with the public reaction in the United States and abroad. And he says it was this public reaction which disturbed, confused, suspicious, uncertain of the truth, that apparently helped decide President Johnson to appoint the commission. It is the same public reaction that has greatly influenced the commission's approach